Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's podcast episode of Is It Readable with Simon and Isaac, where we judge books by their content so you don't judge books by their cover. This week, we'll be talking about Kindred, one of the most acclaimed books by the superstar author Octavia E. Butler. The book, written in 1979, was met with high praise from reviewers and has been read by book clubs and students ever since. But we are here to tell you if it's really worth the hype.
Here's a quick summary of the book for those of you who haven't read it. It follows a young African American woman named Dana who is from 1976 California. She travels back in time to her ancestor Rufus, a young white boy in antebellum Maryland, whenever he has a near-death experience, going back to her time whenever she has a near-death experience. For example, a few months back in Rufus's time is maybe just like a week or so back in Dana's time. Dana saves Rufus in a river the first time she goes back, before almost being shot by Rufus's father, who is a racist slave owner, causing her to go back to her time. She then goes back to save Rufus from a fire which he set in retaliation to a fight with his father, and then, while in Rufus's time, tries to go find another one of her ancestors, her great-great-grandmother Alice, and almost gets raped while at Alice's house, leading her to go back to her time. She then travels back again to Rufus's time when he falls and breaks his leg, bringing her white husband Kevin along this time, and then tries to teach him slaves how to read, slaves that are owned by Rufus's father, before getting whipped by Rufus's father as a punishment for this, inadvertently leaving Kevin in the past. She then travels back to the past when Rufus gets beat almost half to death by a slave named Isaac, who is Alice's husband. Rufus, who is in love with Alice, tries to use Dana to help Alice fall in love with him, which is a weird thing in and of its own, and that obviously doesn't really work. Kevin, who has spent 5 years in the past, finds Dana in Maryland and tries to leave the slaves and the whole plantation with Dana. But Rufus, who has become protective of Dana weirdly, threatens to shoot them, causing them to go home. Dana then travels another time back into the past, finding Rufus lying unconscious in a ditch, and tries to nurse him back to health. As Rufus's parents die of old age, Dana and Rufus's relationship gets put in strain as Rufus blames Dana for his parents' death, since she's not a magician. She can't help make them feel better. Rufus, becoming weirdly protective of Dana, sells a slave who flirts with her, which Dana is obviously really upset about because that's a horrific thing to do, leading to a fight between the two of them where Dana slits her wrist to get back home. For the final time, Dana goes back in time to see that Alice is dead because Rufus fake sold their children in retaliation to a fight that they had, and he almost commits suicide in guilt and grief. But Dana kills him, disgusted by his actions, and that's about it. That's the whole book. My rating of the book would be a 4 out of 5. One of the main reasons being the electric beginning scenes of the book. Its quick pace leads the audience to feel Dana's confusion, which helps us relate to the main character, and all the characters in these opening scenes are very intriguing. We don't know much about them, and a lot of them are better than they are later in the book. For example, Rufus isn't a terrible person during this time. He's kind of just a kid who is racist because of his upbringing. It's not directly his fault. We aren't really upset with him. And one scene I would use to show this kind of confusion and fast pace, and also kind of Rufus's kind of like innocence and the overall kind of like comedic sprinkling that's in these early scenes, is this quote where it says, "Oh, Rufus, baby," that's his mom. "Rufus, ugly name to inflict on a reasonably nice-looking little kid." As you can see in this quote, we can kind of see that Dana doesn't hate Rufus, kind of almost defending him and feeling pity for him having such a ugly name, as she calls it. But then, one paragraph later, we get, "I turned startled and found myself looking down the barrel of the longest rifle I had ever seen." As you can see, with that scene, it goes from kind of a quick, like, we're still confused, but it's kind of funny, to Dana is about to die. And I think this is really good it keeps you hooked to the book, and overall is the best part of the book in my opinion.
All right, Isaac, your critique kind of made me rethink how rough I was on Kindred, but I gave it a 3.5 out of 5, and I know it's supposed to be a total gut punch, and it does a really good job at doing that. But for me, the power of the themes, this is my main critique, that the power of the themes is sometimes undercut by some of the structural and narrative choices. And my very biggest issue is that around the sketchy rules of time travel. But I also think the book relies too much on making the characters and their modern relationships fall apart way too quickly. And through doing that, it sacrifices nuance for developing themes, and it leaves the reader feeling very exhausted by repetition. And for the first scene I'll dive into, it's very similar to the one Isaac dived into, but it has sort of a different approach to it. And I want to start with the central mechanism because that's a foundation for my critique. And Butler describes the time travel as an inexplicable, nightmarish transit that only happens when Rufus is in danger and only stops when Dana is in mortal terror. And so, in the first the chapter "The River," where she saves Rufus, then finds herself looking down the barrel of a rifle aimed by Tom Whalen. She only gets sent home because she panics when faced with death. And the problem with that is that the narrative is totally dependent on this arbitrary force. And this means that Dana must perpetually court extreme danger just to survive, turning her body into a temporal emergency brake. And this convenient coincidence gets the plot moving but leaves the core mechanism feeling very flimsy to me.
Another key part of the book that I would like to touch on are the setting and the symbolism that provides. The smaller setting of the book, like being trapped in kind of this one house, this one part of Maryland, contributes to this feeling of Dana always being stuck and always in danger during this time period. The different times are also pretty distinct. Like there's a scene where after being in the past for 5 years, Kevin comes back, hears a jet flying by, he's very confused. We get this very out of place feeling that Kevin has. One quote I like to use to show the setting being kind of a symbol is this quote on page 156. I sat her down at the table and gave her a knife and some potatoes to peel. The scene reminded me of my own first time in the cookhouse when I had sat peeling potatoes until Kevin called me away. We can kind of see how in the scene she's teaching Alice the ways of the house and how things work, and we can kind of see how Dana is being changed by her new time. She's able to teach it to other people, and instead of what she had hoped is that she would be changing the old time, that she would be freeing people, liberating people, which is kind of contributing to this feeling of being stuck and being in danger, as I was saying. Another quote I like to use to kind of show this being in danger is way back in the beginning when she's going to find Alice on page 34, where she says, I froze, too terrified to even scream, then realized that it was just some small animal that I had frightened. This scene kind of shows she's walking through the forest and she almost gets scared back to her own time just by a small little animal. And this feeling where she's just maybe a mile away from the house and she's already in these situations where she's in a lot of danger. That really contributes to the cramped setting that contributes to the book's theme of how entrapping slavery was.
Those are some great points, Isaac. For my next critique, it's more focused on characterization and theme, specifically how easy the modern characters are corrupted. The book heavily suggests that the boundary between Kevin, this white progressive husband, and Rufus, the white master ancestor, is thinner than Dana wants to believe. We see this when Dana and Kevin are stranded together and decide to play the roles of master and slave for their security. Dana admits she feels shame and guilt, feeling, quote, as though I was really doing something shameful, happily playing a whore for my supposed owner. This realization hits way too fast. The oppressive setting, the narrative, and even Kevin push Dana into the most degrading role immediately. Kevin, who spent 5 years helping the Underground Railroad, is still accused of having, quote, too much sense by Rufus when Rufus suggests Kevin should just leave her. It feels like the book works too hard and too fast to prove its point that the husband is just a step away from the master. It strips Dana of any meaningful chance to resist the psychological corrosion, making character development feel deterministic rather than truly complex.
One final thing I would like to touch on that I think is a really important part of the story is the ending. I feel like the ending really wraps up the story pretty nicely. Uh, the epilogue, especially with the last really chapter or so, I felt that it was almost too fast. A lot of things were happening. It was very uncomfortable, which I get was kind of the point, but it wasn't really as enjoyable of a read. It was definitely thought provoking, but not really as enjoyable as the rest of the book had been. But in the epilogue, and we kind of embrace Dana's like point of view, being back in her time. She travels back to Maryland to kind of piece together what happened. She says, after finding that every single slave on the plantation, besides a select few, was sold after Rufus dies, she says, I thought about that, put together as many pieces as I could. And then she goes on to describe how she thinks the rest of the events happened. So we get her being fully back in her own time, and we also get to know what happens after she left the old time with Rufus and everybody else. And this really wraps up the story nicely. We get endings for all the characters, and I would say that really kind of puts a bow on the book and wraps it up just nicely, which makes me enjoy it even more.
My last critique, I just want to talk a little bit about the pacing and ending. Uh, the pacing and plot becomes frustrating due to the constant repetitive futility. Dana keeps going back, trying to influence Rufus, hoping to stop him from becoming the monster she knows he must be to ensure her own birth. But she constantly fails, realizing she's just an observer watching a show and a poor actor who can't actually change history. When Rufus sells James just because Sam was interested in Dana, it proves her long efforts were pointless. This cycle of Dana's brutalization, followed by her escape, followed by Rufus' inevitable descent, makes the plot feel like Dana is trapped in a loop with no victory possible. The ending, where she stabs Rufus but loses her arm, represents the lasting physical cost of this exhausting, repetitive struggle that the time travel structure never truly lets her win.
Well, that wraps up another episode of Is It Readable? Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed our review of Kindred, and give it a read if you can get your hands on it. See you next time.